Thank you, Anshi, and thank you so much, Cosmin and Celia and your wonderful team for inviting me to participate in this fabulous conference. And thank you, everyone, for sticking around. I'm the last speaker of the day. Do I need to do the doof, 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 doof? No? Everyone's like, you're all okay, you're awake, and it's actually nice to come after the break, right? Because you've actually like stood up and walked around and done all of those sort of things. So awesome. Looking forward to the wine later. Okay, so thank you again for having me. It's my first time to Hong Kong. So I'm quite overwhelmed by the sheer density and concrete of the city, as well as fascinated with how much effort has gone into trying to create spaces of balance and harmony within that density. I'm very much a small island, small town girl. Okay, so I have a background in anthropology, interdisciplinary Pacific Island studies, and dance, but in recent years have spent more of my time translating my research into the visual arts. I was excited to see the site-specific work by Lara, I'm not sure how to pronounce her last name, Almarsegui? I was excited to see her work at the M+ yesterday, having spent years in archives staring at reports of the British, Australian, and New Zealand phosphate mining industry in the Central Pacific, and imagining the significance of each ton of shipped phosphate rock, each piece of steel, metal corrugated iron, cement, glass, fiberglass, and plastic that was brought to my ancestral island of Banaba, transforming it from 6 square kilometers of relatively habitable oceanic space, where my ancestors lived for 3,000 years, into a post-colonial industrial wasteland. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay, because to me I sound super quiet, but... In the beginning, heaven was a rock, lying over earth and rooted in the deep places of the sea. All the lands of the ancestors were embedded in the rock of heaven and stood out like hills upon the overside. Banaba was Te Puto, the navel, and all the multitude of lands and ancestors in Te Bongiro, the darkness, lay around it. In the time of Te Bongiro, heaven began to move, and the earth began to move. They rubbed together as the two hands of a person are rubbed together, and from this came Tabakea, the turtle, the first of all. Tabakea lived on Banaba with Naka, his brother. With them lived Auriria, the giant, Tabuariki, the shark, and thunder, Situabine, the stingray and lightning, and Tapurimai, Nawai, Aurao, and many others. The inhabitants of heaven began to have children. Tanganang conceived and bore a child. It was the bird Tekunei. The bird grew large, and it would fly across the sea, catching fish for food, always bringing some home for its mother. There came a time when the bird flew very far and caught a rerepa fish, which it carried back to Banaba. Tanganang did not kill the fish, she kept it in a bowl of seawater. But the small rerepa grew into a large urua fish, the full size of a man. They feared it and cast it into the sea, but the urua returned with many great and fierce fish. Tabakea decided to save them from the urua with a thought, a little peru or lizard, which he cast into a fire. He put the ashes into a clamshell filled with water, and after 3 moons, Nariao, the spider, emerged from the shell. Tabakea repeated this process with Nariao several times until he was the size of a small man. He then claimed him as a son. Narirao destroyed the urua and scattered his bones across Banaba. Aurieria became the lord of Te Bongiro, and he pierced the heavens with his staff. The navel, the rock of Banaba, then fell into the sea upside down with its roots in the air, burying Tabakea underneath. Aurieria traveled southward until his foot struck a reef rock. There he stayed, and he made a great land which he named Samoa. He met a razor clam, Katas, which he flew into the east, and that was the sun. And again he took a shellfish, Nimatanin, and that was the moon. Then he took the body of Riki, the eel, and laid it across the sky. The white belly of Riki can be seen today. It is the Milky Way. Then Aurieria planted a tree on Samoa from which sprang a host of ancestors. He returned to Banaba, and his children are there to this day. Banaba is the body of the land and the body of the people, Te Puto, the navel from which all springs. I share this oral tradition with you today to illustrate the very, very site-specific nature of my work, where Banaba, a very specific island with specific connections to me and specific histories, is centered, and from which all methods, frameworks, and ways of thinking, knowing, and being emerge. I shared more of this methodology during the workshops with some of the participants, so I'm not going to talk as much about methodology today. But how Banaba was formed from the sea and the sky over hundreds and thousands of years through the actions of ancestral deities and the organic and chemical actions of birds, bird droppings, the remains of marine life, and the sheer pressure of the ocean acting on calcium phosphate is how I figured out what to do with 20 years of archival, ethnographic, visual, and other forms of data. Banaba is made almost completely of phosphate rock. Phosphate rock is critical to the global production of phosphate fertilizers, which fuel mass farming and mass agriculture. In 1900, New Zealander Albert Ellis discovered significant deposits on Nauru and Banaba after analyzing the large rock doorstop that had propped open the office of a guano mining company in Sydney for years. He would proclaim later that phosphate was the absolute basis of humanity and civilization because there is no other way to multiply food production than by increasing chemical inputs into deficient landscapes. 100 years later, the world is still obsessed with phosphate, but available rock reserves have shrunk drastically. Banaba is now riddled with industrial debris and asbestos that threatens the health of the 300 caretakers who live there on a daily basis. Project Banaba invokes the historical and contemporary impacts of colonialism and extractive industries on small islands and the long-term consequences of environmental destruction and indigenous displacement. Banaba is profoundly polluted, but not just in material or environmental ways, but in social, political, and spiritual ways too. Any research on current or future solutions to the world's greatest environmental, climate, or pollution problems cannot ignore the role of colonialism, imperialism, and the appropriation of natural resources by powerful countries to fuel unsustainable, but probably unstable, consumption and lifestyles. Technical solutions alone cannot address unequal structures of power and historical injustices that must be faced in order to bring balance between human societies and their environments. Lewis and Maslin wrote in a new book called The Human Planet, the Anthropocene began with widespread colonialism and slavery. It is a story of how people treat the environment and how people treat each other. So for a bit of context, there are some recent news items that I'd like to share. The first, by Damien Carrington, appeared in The Guardian, and it's titled, "Phosphate Fertilizer Crisis Threatens World Food Supply." The world faces an imminent crisis in the supply of phosphate, a critical fertilizer that underpins the world's food supply, scientists have warned. Phosphate is an essential mineral for all life on Earth and is added to farmers' fields in huge quantities. But rock phosphate is a finite resource, and the biggest supplies are mined in politically unstable places, posing risks to the many countries that have little or no reserves. Phosphate use has quadrupled in the last 50 years as the global population has grown. Researchers say humanity could only produce half the food it does without phosphate and nitrogen, though the latter is essentially limitless as it makes up almost 80% of the atmosphere. At current rates of use, a lot of countries are set to run out of their domestic supply in the next generation, including the US, China, and India. Morocco and Moroccan-occupied territory of Western Sahara host by far the largest reserve, with China, Algeria, and Syria the next biggest, together representing more than 80% of global rock phosphate. Excessive use of phosphate is also causing widespread pollution that leads to dead zones in rivers and seas. In 2015, research published in Science cited phosphorus pollution as one of the most serious problems the planet faces, ahead of climate change. Phosphate expert Marissa de Boer said, the public lack of awareness means that the issue is the, quote, unknown environmental crisis. We really depend on phosphate, but we take it for granted. De Boer ran a 5-year project on technologies to recycle phosphate, looking to commercialize ways of extracting it from human waste, food waste, and industrial waste. She said, quote, as long as people have to go to the toilet and wastewater treatment is centralized, we can use our own phosphate. So it is possible to recycle phosphate from human sewage, manure, bones, and abattoir waste, and use new plant breeds that can draw minerals more effectively from the soil. All this requires the appropriate technology and regulations to ensure there is no contamination and infection of food crops. However, Carrington's skimming over, quote, politically unstable parts of the world reveals how phosphate mining is seen to trump the needs of people on the ground, a sacrifice that communities on these lands ought to be making for the greater good, because who doesn't need food? 1912. Naturally, some think the native owners are right. Yet it is inconceivable that less than 500 Ocean Island-born natives can be allowed to prevent the mining and export of a product of such immense value to all the rest of mankind. 1919. Let's all be thankful island, a little spot in the South Pacific which multiplies the world's food. 2019. The Business and Human Rights Resource Center said in August, the indigenous Sahrawi people accuse the New Zealand fertilizer companies of helping prop up their oppression. In the same way that blood diamonds refer to precious stones mined to finance a warlord's activities, they say what is being mined in Western Sahara is rightly called blood phosphate. Dihani Mohammed told the ODT, the complicity of the New Zealand government with the companies Balance and Ravensdown and the silence of the New Zealand people is increasing the suffering of the Sahrawi people in the territories occupied by the Moroccans and in refugee camps. Both New Zealand fertilizer companies have defended their use of Western Sahara phosphate, saying, quote, it's a complex geopolitical issue. Such complex geopolitical issues have regularly surrounded the extraction and manufacture of phosphate fertilizer, including from the Pacific, where indigenous peoples were expected to give up their lands for inadequate or no compensation to fuel the fertilizer needs of British imperial agriculture and the production of wheat, grain, lamb, beef, butter, and milk that Australia and New Zealand are so well known for. From March to September this year, my exhibition, Project Banaba, was on show at MTG Hawke's Bay Taiahuriri Gallery, exactly 5 minutes down the road from the Ravensdown fertilizer plant at the center of the Moroccan controversy. The plant on this site had manufactured a wide variety of phosphorus and nitrogen-yielding fertilizer for decades from Banaban and Nauruan sources. My exhibition was about that source mine from my father's ancestral lands. During the launch, the chair of the Napier City Council said he was stunned to hear about this history. He said that aside from Ravensdown employees, most people in the region had no idea of the global historical and ethical implications of the activities at the plant. Most people did not realize that New Zealand had been consuming Pacific phosphate for decades, multiplying their agricultural outputs while polluting New Zealand waterways. Many Maori and Pacific Islanders who visited the exhibition also understood the spiritual and cultural implications of extracting Banaban land, because our identities and values are deeply rooted in landscapes that are seen as sentient and kin. Banabans are born of the rock, and our ancestors buried in the landscapes for centuries, so they are part of the rocks. So spreading Banaba across New Zealand through aerial and other forms of top dressing is, as the Maori curator Tehira Henderson yelled to the crowd at the opening of Project Banaba, one of the most shameful things he's ever heard of, the worst thing you can do to Indigenous peoples, taking their bones and spreading them across other people's lands and eating them. The iconic image of New Zealand crop duster spreading Banaban and Nauruan phosphate across hill country was a key motif for the exhibition, which I replicated throughout the show. The co-curator of Project Banaba, Jess Mio, decided to include a short film, and we attempted to get some footage from the phosphate plant. As we pulled up to a fairly public intersection near Ravensdown to get a closer look at the buildings, an employee in an orange high-vis vest, I swear this woman like magically appeared out of nowhere, to ask what we were doing. Jess pointed to our Napier Council vehicle, but she pointed at every patch of grass surrounding the intersection and said, "That belongs to Ravensdown, that belongs to Ravensdown, and that belongs to Ravensdown. No filming any buildings without permission." So we crossed the road to the very public beach and took all manner of photos and footage of Ravensdown. Now, phosphate mining occurs within a genealogy of environmental or green imperialism, which I think Sujata would have referred to earlier. And this green imperialism has drastically transformed the Pacific through resource extraction, deforestation and overfishing, depopulation due to labor migration, blackbirding and European diseases, and the replacement of indigenous agriculture, cultivation, and sustainable resource management with foreign livestock and farming practices, pests such as rats and toads, and invasive plant species. In her thesis on creativity and environmental movements in Oceania, Tale Mangione writes about how following a green imperialism that began in the 16th century, staunch settler colonialism lasting from the 18th century until now intensified the environmental devastation of Oceania, in which European, that is mainly British, German, and French, and American empires tightened their grip on the region by procuring colonies and territories. Bringing large-scale environmental change, forests were logged to make room for plantation agriculture with the monocultural production of cash crops like copra, sugar, pineapple, coffee, as well as palm oil, rubber, cocoa, rice, and tea. Extractive industries burgeoned as mines for alluvial gold in New Zealand, nickel in New Caledonia and the Solomons, copper in Bougainville were all built. Phosphate taken from French Polynesia, Palau, Kiribati, and Nauru enriched Japanese, New Zealand, Australian, and American soils as fertilizer, rendering islands like Banaba uninhabitable. These examples demonstrate how settler colonialism homogenized a capital-intensive system which organized and appropriated people, trade, economies, and environments across Oceania. Banaba was also targeted by Japanese forces during World War II, resulting in the indigenous Banabans' removal to various war camps and eventually to Rambi Island in Fiji in 1945, where most have lived ever since. The small group of Banaban and Gilbertese caretakers live on the island today, amongst a space littered with crumbling infrastructure, asbestos, rusted tractors and rail carts, and broken glass. The island is almost completely covered by overgrowth and limestone pinnacles, marking the pits where 22 million tons of rock was removed. There's been no clearing, no cleanup of the island since the company left in 1979. It stands preserved as an unsettling tropical parable of caution, a ghost town in the middle of the Pacific Ocean that points clearly to the damaging impacts of industrialization, colonialism, capitalism, and global agriculture. The 22 million tons of phosphate rock shipped from Banaba reduced its original height from around 80 meters above sea level by between 30 to 50 meters in some places. Mining also destroyed cultivated plants and fruit-bearing trees, and 4 of the 7 underground freshwater caves that had been a critical source for Banabans in this very drought-prone Pacific equatorial belt. The remaining 3 caves were then polluted during World War II and from mining runoff. Randy Thaman and Mahoney Samuelu conducted a study of the existing vascular plants, vegetation, and ethnobotany of Banaba and said, "The flora of the raised phosphatic limestones on the island of Banaba is extremely degraded and very limited compared to the floras of larger limestone and volcanic islands of the tropical Pacific Ocean. Isolation, small size, prolonged droughts, water scarcity, almost 80 years of open-cast mining, and subsequent abandonment, widespread destruction and devastation, relocation and death of the Banaban people during and after the war have led to serious disturbance, displacement, and loss. Essentially, the damage to Banaba is irreversible, but different groups have been imagining a variety of technical solutions. Maybe shipping the pinnacles for ornamental uses, grinding down the pinnacles and leveling the land, mining out the rest of the phosphate, bringing in soil from other places, and the list goes on. No actual plans for rehabilitation have been implemented by the Kiribati government, and Banaba continues to remain isolated, no electricity, no running water, no major health services, and very, very intermittent delivery of goods by ship from Teaiwa. The motto of the 6,000 or so Banabans in Kiribati and those displaced to Fiji is, "Our God help us." So to track and continue to keep the now broken, shipped, and processed island alive in the imagination of Banabans, other Pacific Islanders, scholars, students, and the 3 responsible governments, and the public, over the last 20 years, I've taken my research and essentially remixed all the data I've collected over the years into textual, choreographic, and visual forms. Remix is appropriate for Banaba, as the rocks have literally been mixed into other landscapes and across multiple agricultural commodity chains and consumed by global populations. Remix with serious consequence is an apt metaphor for our times. So now what I'm going to do, I'm going for time, is run through the various ways I mixed the different fragments that I have from archival work and ethnographic work into different projects. So this map represents the itinerary of my research, where I'm following the people, following the island, and following the stories to various sites across the Pacific. And if I had a larger budget for my work, I would follow it to Europe, I would follow it to the Americas, I would follow it to Japan as well. But I've been tracking all kinds of fragments of Banaba along this particular itinerary. Some of the fragments include archival images from the National Archives of Australia, and the National Archives of Australia have over 500 meters, so half a kilometer of records just about Banaba, which for me could be remixed for thousands of years into the future. They document what the island looked like before mining, and then the ways in which it was systematically destroyed through mining as various levels of technology and efficiency increased within the mining process. Really interesting for me, and this is another kind of like pathway that I haven't been able to track fully, is the fact that quite a lot of workers were brought to work on Banaba from Japan initially, and then from Hong Kong. So over the years, thousands of laborers from Japan and from Hong Kong lived, and many of them died on Banaba. And many of them are still buried there. It was a very segregated space, and they would have segregated cemeteries, so a Chinese cemetery, a Japanese cemetery, a Tuvaluan cemetery, a Banaban cemetery, and then a cemetery for white people. So this is one of the fragments of the archives that I'm hoping to follow. I combine this then with my ethnographic work, my actual travels to Banaba, and my visual documentation of what the island looks like today. And I also articulate this with the sheer amount of media and publicity that was brought globally, really, to the island when the Banabans decided to sue the British Empire for the destruction of their island home. So they literally took the crown to the High Court and said that they were bad colonizers. And it was the longest civil suit at the time in the 1970s. And of course, the Banabans lost, but it was seen globally as this very David and Goliath kind of drama. And the British public got involved, and children got involved, and children would like put their £1 notes into envelopes and send them to the Banabans in Fiji saying, "We're on your side, our government is evil." So this is in the 1970s. But the Banabans lost, so of course they lost, because it would have set an amazing precedent if they'd won. The Banabans also used their performing arts as a way to reinforce their argument that they were a sovereign and independent people who deserved justice. And so every time they would fly to London for the lawsuit, they would take their dancers with them, and they would march through the streets of London. And so the British newspapers were very fascinated with these Pacific natives. This is like happening automatically, by the way. It's like forwarding the slides. The British public was fascinated with this, and the media would ask them, "Who are you?" And they would say, "We, the Banabans, are people who dance like this," because for them, who they were was expressed and articulated through their performing arts. So dance was very political for the Banabans. It showed the world that they'd survived this like mining and displacement. So for me, I'm constantly reading between the multi-sidedness of the island, the multi-sidedness of the Banabans, and trying to imagine what multi-sided indigeneity looks like and means, because we're used to the concept of indigeneity being very in place. But our place is everywhere. So I started to send my research to various artists. The first one being a sculptor, a Maori sculptor, Brett Graham, because I wanted to see what others would do with this, work that I'd collected over the years. And so he looked at it from a Maori perspective, because there is a famous Maori saying, "Ka mate kainga tahi, ka ora kainga rua," meaning when the first home falls, a second will rise. So he made these kind kind of phosphate coffins to signal the removal of the island. And then we projected some of the archival images and ethnographic images onto these sort of rusted steel spheres to represent the industrialization and the destruction of the island through the industrial process. I also sent my work to the Museum of New Zealand, Te Papa Tongarewa, and they decided to incorporate it into their permanent exhibition, which ran for 10 years, from 2007 to 2017. In fact, I think it ran to 2018. And we had to argue that this was such a critical story to New Zealand national history, and it had to be included in the Museum of New Zealand, and that was a very controversial process, but eventually we got it in, and this permanent installation included, where they juxtaposed cultural survival and resilience through dance with the story of the mining, which was told through the film next to the dance costume. So that was another kind of remix of the work. As an academic, I also had to write the book, which was painful. So painful that I just can't even imagine ever writing a book again, and have given back 2 book contracts ever since then, because the book actually did pretty well and people use it in their anthropology and their history classes, but it was just so painful to synthesize. It's just against my being to synthesize things into any kind of narrative that people can consume and be happy with, because I like to do things in fragments. Fragmentation makes a lot of sense to me. So I tried to incorporate some level of fragmentation into the book. But my work has been remixed by others who kind of take bits and pieces of it and combine it with other narratives and other stories. And this is one example from the Hakave Technosphere magazine, who did super cool things with one of my journal articles. And then I was involved in another project where 150 visual arts honors students from the University of New South Wales took a portion of my research, and through their own imagination of what they thought it meant, produced graphic novels, comic books, essentially, which told the story from their perspective and their imagination of the island. And it was really cool to see all of these different versions of Banaba and the Banabans story through the eyes of those students. So this is just a couple of examples of what they produced. And then one particular artist, who was a Brazilian artist who was at UNSW at the time, I decided to work with him and this project at the University of Humboldt, where we kind of worked between science and design and my personal story to kind of reimagine it as a book chapter for this particular project, Eating Anthropocene, which was telling stories about food, but particularly phosphorus, from all of these different cultural and national contexts. And then finally, after sharing my research with all these different people who are imagining it in all these different ways, my friend Yuki Kihara, who is also a visual artist, challenged me to be the visual artist and see if I could do this by myself, which was super scary and exhausting for me to imagine doing. But it turned out, because I had been visualizing these fragments in really specific ways for 20 years, I had quite a clear vision of what it would look like in a particular space. So I got a commission from Carriage Works in Sydney to translate the research for this particular space, Bay 19. And I proceeded to figure out what to do with all my archival and ethnographic and visual fragments. So one of the things I kind of honed in on was the industrial process, and some of the iconic images from the company that had produced the fertilizer, which it then put into these iconic sacks that then got stacked on trains and then kind of spread across Victoria to go to all the farms. And I took that logo of Pivot, which is quite a well-known fertilizer company, and then I mapped it onto textiles for the show. I also wanted to bring our ancestors into the space and juxtapose the ancestors with the industrial process. So I took the archival images of our ancestors from the early 1900s and printed them on voile so that they could be kind of like a ghostly, watchful presence in the space amongst textiles that were otherwise quite solid and real to represent the rocks that had been shipped. So this is kind of what it ended up looking like in that space. And I was also trying to reference the pinnacle kind of structure of the island at the moment, but doing it from the ceiling rather than the floor, because I'm very interested in this idea that land can come from both the sky as well as the sea. And I wanted to flip it for this exhibition. I also had a 3-screen projection in the back, and I'm hoping to show you some of that 3-screen projection in a minute. This is just another angle of the exhibition. I took all these like amazing quotes from the archives and like stamped it on those Hessian sacks. The other side of the sacks, I used cotton and calico to directly reference the pinnacle landscape, but also to pick up on the kind of clothing that the colonial officials always wore in the mines, where they were like in these perfect white suits, fully protected from the sun. So that was what the reference was there. And that's just another image of the 3-screen projection. It was all pretty like dire and doomy and pitiful and sad for audience members, and I knew that that's one of the ways in which people would interpret the story. So I brought my family into the exhibition to, illustrate the way in which people are just getting on with their lives. Like, they're not like sitting around being obsessed with all the horrible things that had happened of the past, even though those things are very present and they're very real. So we created a photo reef where if you go in, you can just see Banabans hanging out, doing the thing, drinking kava, playing board games, washing the clothes, doing the dishes, having a chat. And that was all in that space as well, to kind of speak back to the very heavy history in the rest of the space. And this is just another version of it, which was the MTG Hawke's Bay gallery version. And finally, I wanted to highlight this one because when we were, one of the things I've decided to do with the exhibition is make it open, because I actually really don't like the idea of solo artists, whatever that is. And so I opened it up to whatever narratives people from the community around Hawke's Bay might bring to the exhibition. So that is a skirt, a dancing skirt, a Cook Islands dancing skirt made out of phosphate sacks from the Ravensdown plant. And so the woman who came and, I was telling her about the exhibition, she was like, oh my God, when I was 15, we used to go to the phosphate plant and collect all of their sacks because they make these perfect skirts for our Cook Islands dancing. So in a way, I was able to link this history to the story of migrants, Cook Island migrants in that area, and kind of like expand the stories and the material basis of the history as well into other people's experiences. And I want to continue to do that because the phosphate's going to follow the chain of commodities and follow the archives and follow the colonial stories in terms of where I've decided to show it. Okay, so I'm just going to end then with the 3-screen projection, which you'd have to imagine bigger, but so it's going to look a bit small here, but you should get the picture of what we're trying to say here. It's kind of like a remix of everything I just said. Hello.
and get it, come and get it. With Peter Russell Clark in the city or the outback, he's Australia's brightest spark. Come and get it, come and get it. Good food you love to eat. Come and get it, come and get it. And there's people you can meet. Cook a shark or make a damper. Feed your ego, pack a hamper. On a farm or out at sea. Learn a recipe or three. Come and get it with Peter Russell Clark.
Namba sirong taramati, taramati, taas po. Number 1 taramati, taramati, taas po. Number 1 taramati, taramati, taas po. Number 2 taramati, taramati, taas po.
And I pray, I'm James Bond. Good morning, cowboys. Sa tukang tirambulay, mga cowboys. Si Monte Fiji ay raw nanura. Sign do kung kain merivit, Jackie Chan, tawat ipe, James Bond, nururing agmandol. Tawatarang one wim, pakukawan mo na ko, Rambo. Some billy wine, take away, China pray. I'm James Bond, good morning, cowboy. Sa tukang tirambulay, mga cowboys. Si Monte Fiji ay raw nanura.
A journey of 1,000 miles begins beneath one's feet in the earth. Mother Earth, Father Sky. Somewhere in the Pacific, they say that men have wings while women have only feet. In other parts of the Pacific, they say women belong to the land while men belong to the sea. Have you ever seen and heard a woman stand on the beach and wail at the sea and sky?